awareness around lynchings and the history of that in the Salisbury area. And he's going to talk about the national history of racism. Yeah, maybe not exactly all of it, but a lot. And a lot also in the context of current day statistics and how things are playing out. So we're going to try to make time at the end for questions. I don't know that we're going to have time for breakout group discussion, and this is more factual today it is than maybe as much as like the last presentation, which had some more material that was a little more personal for discussion. But as we go through, feel free to put questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. And if folks really have time and feel the need and want to do a breakout group, we'll just have to see if we have any extra time for that. So I just want to say a quick word of prayer. I just want to thank God for everyone's presence today. I want to ask for the Holy Spirit to guide us, to open our ears so that we can truly hear and truly understand with our minds, our open ears and open minds and open hearts, what it is that we're here to learn tonight, and to see whatever messages God is trying to call us towards in the future. In Jesus' name we do this work. Amen.
Amen.
With that, James, I'm going to turn it over to you. See if
Okay.
you can share your screen with us, and then I'll mute myself. I am going to be muting everyone, and I'm going to hit mute all, and just to keep the background noise down. So if you have questions, again, put them in the chat box. So James, you're going to have to unmute yourself when you're ready to talk, because I caught everybody up in the muting thing. James, I can't hear you.
Okay.
Oh, there
Can you
we
hear
go.
me now?
I gotcha. Yep.
All right, cool. And I guess start video. Oh, there we go. Excellent. All right, so back to the to what I was doing before. Okay, let's see if I can go back to the. Come on. Zoom. Always fun to, like, There we go. Back to the beginning. All right. If everyone can hear me now? Again, my name is James Yamakawa. Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction. I am a chair of social ministry at Faith Lutheran Church in Salisbury, Maryland. Oh, I think the slides are not responding according to my screen here. Come on. Oh, dear. Pardon me, I'm having technical issues with my computer.
While you're doing that, I'll pull mine up in case we need it as a backup, but I think you're going to get yours together first before I get mine.
Well, let's see here. Everyone, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Should be just a moment.
We all know how this goes.
Welcome to the land of Zoom. I'm gonna try to keep it in this screen here so I don't Okay. I think it's loading up now. Okay. Not gonna go through my own personal introduction. Oh, it's not responding again? Oh no. Come on.
Let me see if I can. I can get it, if I can get mine open. Can I try mine, James?
Yeah, but please, by all means. I don't know why all of a sudden it's not working for me.
That's all we can do.
James, you can stop sharing your screen.
Cool, thank you.
All right.
Let's just go on with the presentation. No more introductions. Okay, can we go to the next screen, please, Kathy? All right, this is a sort of history of racial inequality in America, and I say a sort of only because when I was approached to do this, I was thinking about, like, how do you put 400 years of history into a short Zoom presentation, and I realized I couldn't. One of the things I was thinking about, actually, a little side anecdote, was my kids' STEM program at their middle school. They do, like, the individual subjects, but they only do one topic in each of the subjects. So instead of, like, going to a bunch of different, like, like parts of history, they go into one part of history, but from all different disciplines. So in a way, they go a lot deeper rather than going wider. But of course, we're gonna go a little wide to start with. So next slide, please. That's a little joke for anyone who has the Pikachu meme thing going on. All right. Obviously, when you talk about racial inequality in America, you can't not talk about basically the genocide of indigenous peoples in America. See on the top left of the screen right there, there is like a kind of interactive map like that shows you how lands were stolen from indigenous peoples over the course of centuries. Bottom left, we have the an image of the Trail of Tears. Upper right, we have the massacred Wounded Knee. And the bottom right, we have what's currently going on, like, in the modern day, is like the Standing Rock protest, and then as well as pretty much any indigenous movement to try to basically get their own sovereignty, established. So obviously, like, that is integral to how we can understand our country's history, is because this land was already inhabited when people got here. So next slide, please. You can also talk about anti-Asian discrimination. Short note, I am half Japanese, so I have some history with this. We have, on the top left, we have images from what is known as the Chinese Massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles, where 17, actually probably more than 17 men and boys were lynched by a mob in Los Angeles. Top right, we have the Japanese internment during World War II. We have bottom left, Vincent Shin. He was murdered by two white auto workers. They thought he was Japanese, but he was Chinese. But that was kind of when a lot of the auto jobs were going over to Japan. So it was a lot of attention with that. Bottom right, we have where we are right now with the coronavirus and the anti-Asian discrimination coming from that. All that is tied into the long history of the Yellow Peril, basically the otherification of people from East Asia specifically, but Asia in general, as being perpetually foreign in America. Next slide. We also have what goes on with our Latinx siblings. Sign, we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. Top right, I just actually started doing a little more research into this, of the history of anti-Mexican discrimination and lynching in the Southwest. the lynching of Josefa Loaiz, I'm going to mess that name up, in California, 1893. The Zoot Suit riots in LA in 1943, which I did not realize was actually a race riot. And then we have obviously what's going on nowadays with the with DACA and with the wall and deportation and the children in concentration camps down at the border. So obviously, you can see from any particular ethnic or racial group, there's going to be a way to talk about the history of inequality in America. Next slide. What all these have in common is the common denominator, which is white supremacy, which is the system of institutional and cultural racism that kind of like, is the parent to all of these discriminations. Next slide. This is a, I've used this pyramid a lot in when I talk to people about this, because it kind of encapsulates a lot of different ideas that people think, oh, what is white supremacy? And people think, oh, it's the KKK. It's people with tiki torches. It's swastikas and neo-Nazis. But obviously, the majority of white supremacy isn't as obvious, at least not obvious to many people. Mass incarceration is an aspect of white supremacy. Hiring discrimination, not challenging racist jokes, everything from the school to prison pipeline to housing discrimination to even talking about how we're all one big human family and there's only one race, the human race. All of that can be used to support white supremacy. And there's another pyramid that a local psychology professor shared a few years back that got a lot of play on conservative news networks. Basically, it made the point of saying that everything on the top is supported by everything on the bottom. So the idea is that the most seemingly innocent stuff, like tokenism, or saying you're so articulate, or even and the ideology of colorblindness, you've heard a lot, are the things that support the more extreme, obvious versions of white supremacy. And all of these are connected, it's just on a spectrum. Next. Lost the screen. Oh. This is an article by a person named Chauncey DeVega. He writes for Salon Magazine. He also has his own podcast. But this is probably one of the best kind of explainers of what white supremacy is. We don't need to go through this. I want everyone to be able to see this on their own time. But if you can, at some point, check this out. I mean, obviously, white supremacy is a very, very, very complicated system. I mean, it's a system. So it can't just be as simple as saying, oh, it's when you hate someone of a different race. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I'm sure you've gotten into that with previous discussions you've had here. So yeah, that's something for everyone to look at some point in the future. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm sure everyone has seen some version of this in recent years. This is a timeline. Zerflin is a company, I believe, and they made this timeline basically from the year 1619. If you've heard of the 1619 Project, that's when the first recorded instance of enslaved African people were kidnapped and brought to the United States. Obviously, they've been going to the Caribbean and South America for many years before this point. You see here the 246 years, roughly, of official American slavery. Then you have the 89 so years at the end of the Civil War. That includes Reconstruction of official Jim Crow segregation. And then after 1954, you have what I've seen some versions of the shirts with the words "free" in quotes on the green part. So that is it's kind of where we are now. There's another timeline later on that is going to explain this a little bit more. So, but it kind of gives you an idea of the scope of what we're talking about. Now, when you see a timeline like this, you really just kind of have to understand that because this takes place over 400 years, there's no possible way we can get through every single instance of inequality in America in the short amount of time we have. But I did find a very, very helpful article from USA Today that had some very, very nice graphs and graphics to kind of explain where inequality stands right now, specifically with anti-blackness in America. Now, there's not saying that white supremacy doesn't affect indigenous, Latino, Asian communities. It's just that when it comes to white supremacy in America, it really started with creation of of blackness and whiteness around the start of slavery. That during the early 17th century, essentially, there were indentured servants, European indentured servants, and enslaved Africans would band together to try to, essentially, earn their rights. But the wealthy plantation owners were not having any of this. So they basically, over the course of a century, created the idea of whiteness and the idea of blackness to kind of justify the economic system of slavery. So with that knowledge, 400 years later, we're still dealing with the fallout from that decision. Next slide. Health and healthcare. Black women die 3 times more often giving birth. So you see here, obviously, for if 13 white women die when giving birth, 41 black women will die giving birth. And so that's an obvious disparity. Up next. Black Americans are dying at a disproportionate rate from COVID-19. There have been numerous articles about that. And again, that has to do with environmental conditions and conditions of poverty or access to healthcare, access to health insurance. So obviously, there's a lot more to do with than just that they happen to be dying at a more disproportionate rate. There's factors that make that more likely. Next page. The fact that black men and black women don't live as long as white men and white women. That's a pretty obvious, way of saying that there is a disparity in health. The percentage of high school students who graduate on time. You can see that, Asian American Pacific Islanders are on the top there. Whites about 89%, Latinos, and then black 79%. So there is a difference there as well. Percentage of students who graduate from 4-year college programs. As you see, it's 24% lower for Black Americans and even lower for indigenous folks. And so the disparity is there as well. School segregation, that's something that we've had to deal with a lot down here in Wicomico. Actually, there was a lawsuit from the Justice Department a few years back that basically that students were being targeted disproportionately in Wicomico schools. And again, that has his history based in segregation. Most schools are so-called diverse, but honestly, there are schools that are primarily black and schools that are primarily white. I mean, there is integration, but it's not actual integration. It shows they've showed that basically school desegregation is kind of picked up in pace in the past couple decades, and a lot of that kind of stems from the original Brown versus Board decision, which kind of supposedly integrated the schools, but didn't really integrate the schools, and it didn't integrate the teachers, for that matter. So school segregation is still a thing in 2020. You hear a lot about the unemployment rate right now, especially with the pandemic going on. The unemployment rate is higher for Black and Hispanics, and even for Asians than for white Americans, and higher than the U.S. average. Next. Out of 500 Fortune companies, only 4 Black CEOs. Now, this data is a year old, but I don't think it's changed all that much. And again, so doesn't mean there aren't Black business owners, but that's even among this one section of apparently the biggest business owners in America, a fraction of them, a small fraction, that is disproportionate to the population. So Homeownership. Homeownership was one of the ways that many white Americans were able to generate familial wealth, generational wealth over time after World War II with the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Acts. The rate of homeownership is still lower for Black, Hispanics, and other races versus whites and even the U.S. average. And that has its history in both in segregation and in redlining, which is the practice of basically making sure that certain areas of cities with predominantly African American populations would not get home loans. So essentially, they could not build up that generational wealth. Poverty rates. Poverty rates obviously are higher for Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other races. Asians a little higher than whites, but white people tend to be on the benefiting end of that spectrum. It could be high for whites, but it's going to be probably at least double for Black Americans. And median income. The median income for a Black family is around $40,000 versus a white family, which is $68,000. So there's obviously a discrepancy there. This is where probably the biggest, well, I'll say that like one of the most important aspects is because who controls the political system kind of controls how everything else works. Currently, right now, there are 52 Black representatives in the House, and if you go on to the next screen, if it was proportionate, there would be more, proportionate to the population in America. So they're underrepresented in the House of Representatives. It gets even worse when you go to the Senate. There are only 3 Black senators out of 100. So if you say Black people are about 17% of the population, there should rightly be about 17 senators, or at least 13. I think the numbers between 13 and 17%. I've heard both numbers, but they should be a lot more senators in the United States Senate. So now you see how that is another example of racial inequality that exists in America right now. Next slide. What most people think about inequality, they usually think about issues to do with the criminal justice system. The rates of incarceration. Now, this is from the 2010 census, but the data is probably roughly transferable for the past decade. Black Americans are disproportionately represented in state and federal prisons. And again, only a small percentage of the population, but a larger disproportionate percentage of the people in federal and state prisons. And of course, with the uprisings after George Floyd, and in recent years with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot more attention has been paid to police brutality and police killings of Black men and women. So the oft-cited statistic is that Black people are roughly 2.5 times as likely to be killed by police as white people, and that's a statistic that always gets shoved down, be like, oh well, more white people are killed by police. And yes, because there are more white people in America, but if you're Black in America, you are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police in America. So that's probably the most glaring inequality right there. So that's a large picture. Now, how we got there is impossible to talk about in the time we have, and I am not well versed enough to talk about it. I don't have the experience. I don't have the academic knowledge to go through that. And I wish I did. But I do know is that sometimes in order for me to understand how everything all fits together, I kind of got to zoom down into one small part. And that's what I've done in my local community with my work with the Equal Justice Initiative, with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, with my group, the Wycomico Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, and with our current Salisbury Lynching Memorial Task Force. We we are trying to get our community to face up to its history of racial terrorism, and specifically 3 lynchings in Salisbury, Maryland. This map, if anyone's familiar with the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama, um, this map here shows roughly the amount of space that these lynchings took up. Obviously, most of them happened in the Deep South and the former Confederate states, but the fact is they happened all over the country, as far as California, as far north as Minnesota. And again, Maryland had over 40. So this the EJI says 29 lynchings. We've actually, with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, has documented over 40. So the numbers that are listed here are not even probably all that actually is. It's just the ones that are confirmed by EJI. Their recent report on Reconstruction adds another couple thousand of deaths during Reconstruction. So it's like, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide. Key findings. Racial terror lynchings were primarily during the Jim Crow era, that yellow part in that one timeline that I put up earlier. They were tools of control. They were basically, if a black person was thought to have gotten out of line, if they talked back to someone, if they happened to say the wrong thing or be in the wrong place at the wrong time, if they were accused, never convicted, but always accused of a crime, a lot of times they were lynched because they were trying to actively like stand up for their own dignity. There was a case of Anthony Crawford in North Carolina. He was trying to get a decent price for his cottonseed, and basically the local white planters were like, no, we're not going to pay you that. And when he refused to sell it, they took him out and lynched him. And there have been incidents of people trying to get people to vote, and they were lynched. People trying to organize workers' unions, they were lynched. So it was a tool of social control. Again, they were much more common than most people know, and they were not limited to the Deep South. They were used to enforce segregation and racial hierarchy. They played a key role in the Great Migration. So that's when blacks in the Deep South migrated. Really, they were refugees, like internally displaced refugees in America, all the way from the Deep South into urban centers in the Northwest and East. There's always a silence around discussions of this history, and we've seen this a lot locally. People don't want to talk about it. At the same time, an uplift of symbols cementing white supremacy in the community. For example, for those of you who don't know, there was a Confederate sign on the courthouse lawn where two of the victims in Salisbury were lynched. That recently came down after a couple years of fighting to get it down. But the point is, like, you know, no one will talk about the history, the violence that happened to people to reinforce white supremacy, and then these monuments to white supremacy go up in their place. They're distortions of history. They can be best understood as having the features of one or more of the following: lynchings that resulted from a widely distorted fear of interracial sex, lynchings in response to casual social transgressions, based on allegations of serious violent crime, public spectacle lynchings, that is almost its own category, but basically you imagine thousands and thousands of people basically coming to watch someone get brutally murdered. Lynchings that escalated into large-scale violence targeting the entire African-American community, and then lynchings of sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted mistreatment, like, again, Anthony Crawford. And again, the decline of lynching, and I'm going to put that in, and that's in quotes for a reason. I'm going to go more on that later. The decline of lynching mirrored the rise of accelerated trials and the use of capital punishment. And all this is available in Equal Justice Initiative's reports. So a little history about the men in Wicomico. Garfield King, he was only 18 years old. He was from the Trap District of Wicomico County. It's closer to the west and the south side. He graduated from the Princess Anne Colored Academy. On May 21st of 1898, he was accused of shooting a 22-year-old white man named Herman Kenny following a dispute they had outside of a store. It was said that Garfield actually, shot Herman Kenny in self-defense. But regardless, Kenny would die 3 days later. In the middle of the night, on May 25th, a mob of roughly 100 to 150 armed white men abducted Garfield King from the county jail, which was located behind the historic courthouse in Salisbury. He was beaten, then he was hung from a tree, and then members of the mob proceeded to shoot his body, and they counted at least 50 bullet holes in him, and numerous ones on the building behind him. So it was definitely a kind of a ritual murder. And as in most lynchings, no one was ever identified as being in the mob that murdered him. Matthew Williams is the name of the person that I've started getting into this history when I learned about him. He's the one we know the most about, because it was obviously later on in local history. He was 23 years old. So today he would be barely out of college, if that. He was born in Virginia, but after his mother died, he came to live with his maternal grandmother in Salisbury at the age of 4. He left school at the age of 14 to support his family. Eventually came to work for a local lumberyard and box factory owner named Daniel J. Elliott and his family. And from all records, he and the family were very close. They were actually very fond of each other. What is known is that on the afternoon of December 4th of 1931, Daniel Elliott was found shot to death, and Matthew Williams was found nearby wounded and accused of his murder. He was taken to Peninsula General Hospital and placed in the Negro ward there. There are conflicting stories about that. That is the official story that ended up in most of the newspapers. There is another story that the person who found Daniel Elliott shot and who presumably wounded Matthew Williams was Daniel Elliott's son, James Elliott. It was supposedly over wages that Matthew Williams thought that Daniel Elliott had owed him. The alternate story, which has been passed around, in the 100 or so years since it happened, was that James Elliott, the son, actually borrowed money from Matthew Williams. And Matthew Williams was very thrifty with his money, apparently. He didn't spend it on anything other than, I think he went to, the barber shop and got his hair done. But past that, he always saved his money. So, and because the family is close, him lending money to his friend James was probably likely. The story goes that James didn't pay it back. Matthew went to his father to try to get him to convince him, and then James shot them both and then framed it on Matthew. So that's the alternate story. But again, no one's going to know the actual truth because there was no trial ever to prove whether Matthew Williams actually did this or not. Later that evening, a mob of several hundred white citizens gathered. They abducted him from Peninsula General Hospital, and if you go to downtown Salisbury, you can see part of the original hospital building remains. They dragged him to the courthouse lawn, and there the crowd swelled to more than 1,000 people. Some estimates upwards of 1,500, 2,000 people. He was beaten, tortured, and hung from a tree. Afterward, his body was dragged through the black neighborhoods of Salisbury before being set on fire in a vacant lot. And again, despite the number of people in the mob and despite over 100 eyewitnesses called to grand jury and proceedings, Matthew was eventually found to have been killed by persons unknown, which again is one of the hallmarks of racial terror lynchings. The last victim was actually not recognized by EJI when we initially approached them about doing soil collections, but through the work of a local historian, we were able to convince them that this person was actually lynched. And basically, they had found a body in the night following Matthew Williams' lynching of a middle-aged black man who had apparently been going out for groceries because they found like half a ham and a side of bacon next to him, wrapped in brown paper. It wasn't a robbery; no one took it. Like a mob found him and beat him to death, and then they dumped his body on the railroad tracks. So that is connected intimately to the lynching of Matthew Williams because it was probably the same mob or people from the mob out looking out for blood, and we don't even know his name, and that's probably the person. Like each one of these victims had dreams and hopes. They had virtues and flaws like any of us, and the fact that his name is known to those he left behind and to God, but we don't know, and that seems, out of all the tragedies, especially tragic. But that's the third incident that we are looking to get the community to kind of reckon with right now in our area. Another high-profile incident actually took place in the weeks following the assassination of Martin Luther King. A young black deaf mute man, like he was accused of robbery and then he got arrested. But when he was supposedly struggled with officers, and once he tried to escape, one of the officers shot him, and he was killed. What followed was several nights of demonstrations and uprisings, and roughly around the same time, you hear about the uprisings in Cambridge, Maryland, with Gloria Richardson. It was a time, obviously, of heightened tension in America, but so the stuff that's happened, like in recent years, especially after Freddie Gray, there was a large demonstration in Salisbury. Obviously, this has been going on for a long time. It's not just something recent that's been happening. So the local history even goes into something that it looks a lot more like what like activists within the Black Lives Matter movement would be fighting against right now. This is a graphic I made a few years back. When I said that, when the rates of lynchings decline, and I put that in quote marks, there's a reason why I put that in quote marks. If you look here, on one side of the image, you have probably one of the more famous images of lynchings, and names of lynching victims. On the bottom right, you see the familiar blue and red lights of a police car, and names of victims of police brutality and murder. There is a direct connection between these two things, and it's something that took me a little while to kind of be willing to explain to myself, because people always worry about whether they would want to be say things that might not be true, but the connections between historic racial terror lynchings and modern day, I call them modern day police lynchings, are more than just echoes. Next slide. Okay. For one, police and law enforcement have historically been complicit in racial terror lynchings. Oftentimes, sheriffs would try to keep the victim safe so they could go to trial, but more often than not, they would give in to the mob. Oftentimes, they were part of the mob. And knowing the history of policing in America has being both evolved from union-breaking forces as well as fugitive slave patrols. So there's a history of policing being connected to racism in America. But most importantly, police have often been complicit in lynchings in the past. Both racial terror lynchings and modern day police lynchings rely on and perpetuate the myth of the black criminal that justify the use of force to control, contain, and segregate. They both reinforce a racial status quo and segregation. calling police on black families in the park, people having a barbecue, people sleeping in their dorm room, men at Starbucks. The list goes on and on. Black delivery drivers. What happened with he was a bird watcher in New York in Central Park, and that lady Amy Cooper, I believe her name was, threatened to call the police on him. Again, this, like, people, white people in America think that black people should not be in certain areas, and police are used to control that nowadays, as lynching was used to control that in years past. You've heard about lynching postcards. These were images of the lynchings. People took postcards, pictures, and put them on postcards, and they would send them to families across the nation. You also have the incident of Matthew Williams, where the body was dragged through the black neighborhoods of Salisbury, to kind of to spread that terror to everyone in the community, and that has its ancestors in, or descendants in, the widely shared viral videos and news stories that we see on YouTube nowadays, and Facebook and Twitter. When I first started paying attention to this, I was sharing those videos because I was like, people need to see it. People need to know this is happening. I've stopped sharing those videos because I have enough friends who have told me they don't want to be traumatized by this anymore. So I don't share those videos anymore because, again, that's just a way of reminding anyone who watches that Black lives don't matter. And the same thing with racial terror lynchings. Lynchings were and are message crimes with the intention and or the effect of terrorizing whole communities, and that's what happens both historically and in present day. The targeting of Black Lives Matter activists and protesters by law enforcement. Historically, you can see that in the FBI's COINTELPRO program back during the Black Power movement. You also can see that now, with the after the uprisings in Ferguson, there have been a suspicious number of activists that have been found dead in recent years. And so, again, the evidence isn't there because we don't know, but again, there's a history of activists and protesters being targeted. So we can't entirely rule that out. I'm in mind to trust them on that one. And the biggest one, again, I was very heartened to hear this. The UN Human Rights Monitors declared recently that there is a direct linkage between historical racial terror lynchings and modern day police and vigilante violence against Black Americans. So it's not just, the activists in America, it's people from across the world are seeing this and saying, this is something that Americans and white Americans need to really dig down and start dealing with, because it hasn't stopped and it's only going to get worse. Next slide. Going back to the idea of timelines, if anyone has been to the National Memorial and the museum down in Montgomery, Alabama, that EJI started, inside it's housed in an old slave warehouse in downtown Montgomery, and on one entire wall is this timeline, and on the far left you have the year 1619 and the kidnapping of enslaved Africans and bringing them over to the New World, so to speak. All the way to the right, in the picture on the top right corner, you see mass incarceration, what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. Right in the middle of that timeline is where I put most of my focus on, is the Jim Crow segregation era and historic racial terror lynchings. Wherever you walk into that timeline, you can walk into that museum and walk at any point of that timeline, look to your left and see where it started, look to your right and see where it's going. So any part of that, you can walk at any point of that, but you can only understand it if you step back and look at the whole and realize that all of this is connected. So when I talk about racial terror lynchings, I am still talking about anti-Blackness, white supremacy, capitalism, authoritarianism, the patriarchy even, and all these intersecting oppressions can be understood through the lens of one topic. But again, you can't see how it all fits together. People think that racial terror lynchings, were just terrible one-off incidents. No, these happened repeatedly throughout American history, and more than likely in a place you live, or near a place you live. And they are part of a continuum of white supremacy that started with the justification for chattel slavery, and continue today to the justification of slavery by another name, which is prison labor. Next slide. This is the timeline I saw. Activist Bree Newsom Bass shared this, and I liked it a lot because it had the whole timeline on there, but it did put the new Jim Crow after the Civil Rights Movement, and also made sure that the Black Lives Matter movement as a counter to white supremacy was put in there. So I like this timeline a lot because it shows you that it's ongoing. And this is something that, again, from what I've learned, it's not like Black people haven't known this has all been going on all this time. It seems to be that many white Americans, maybe not most white Americans, are just now waking up to this fact that all this stuff is actually happening, has been happening, and will continue to happen until we get up off our asses and do something about it. Sorry, I cursed. But yeah, so this timeline right here is probably the one I like to use most often. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The next couple of pages are just links to all the articles and things that I used to kind of gather all the information for this. If Kathy, if you can share the link with anyone who the Google, share to the Google slide link, they can look at these links themselves. And I think I need to start answering questions if you have time. So how do I do that?
We've got plenty of time, and I've been looking at the chat, so I can just let you know. There really so far haven't been any questions except from me. I just want to thank you because you covered a lot of information and in a short period of time, and there I actually thought maybe I could go back to that last slide with the timeline and just have you talk a little bit more. I don't know. Well, I guess whatever do you know about what happened with segregation and Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow?
Well, I mean, like what I know, like I learned from reading Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, like you know, talking about mass incarceration, especially following the start of the war on drugs with the Johnson and the Nixon administrations, basically targeting Black Americans, like, you know, for possession or attempt to distribute of drugs, that was seen in the crack epidemic and in the 80s, and basically that when the slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, Ava DuVernay made the point in her documentary 13th that it abolished slavery except for as punishment for crime. So like enslaved people in prisons nowadays are essentially working as enslaved people. They're working for no pay. They have no freedom, and the police are used to capture them, essentially, kind of like the fugitive slave patrols were back in the day. Essentially, this is an example of modern day slavery. There is like human trafficking going on all across the world right now. It is a big problem. Just when talking about this specific aspect of American history, prison labor is a modern day slavery. That's why there is a modern day abolition movement for that. But segregation still exists, obviously. School segregation, all the disparities in, well, again, things have improved in a lot of ways, but it's never a straight line from bad to good. There's Ibram Kendi talks about a lot in his work about the simultaneous progress of anti-racism and racism simultaneously. So that every time there is a racist progress, a history of chattel slavery, the anti-racist movement, abolition, and the Civil War, and then Reconstruction, was met by a backlash of racist progress, which was the so-called redemption and the lost cause narrative of the South into segregation and Jim Crow. That was, the progress then went to the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement, and then the war on drugs and new Jim Crow came in. So it's kind of like there's always a leapfrogging back and forth progress and between the forces of racism and the forces of anti-racism in American history. So the new Jim Crow just is that. It is the new Jim Crow. Jim Crow of yesteryear, again, now what was shown by what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, earlier this year, was that your classic definition of what a lynching is still happens. There's also a really phenomenal documentary called Always in Season. It came out on PBS Independent Lens. A young black man, a teenager, was found hung from a swing set in his near his house, and the police ruled it a suicide within like a day or something like that. And but the mother is convinced, and the documentary honestly makes a entirely convincing case that he was lynched. And obviously, with the incidents of black people being found hung around the country in recent months, the name of the documentary is Always in Season. There's a link in one of the things, the link things. The link things. I'm sorry. But yeah, so one of the quotes I always say is that the past. This is from I think it's Steinbeck who said this. The past is not dead. It's not even past. Things that happened before are still happening, just in a different way. Slavery evolved. Segregation evolved. Lynching evolved. Because we haven't dealt with the root cause, which is white supremacy. So I don't know if that really answered the old Jim Crow. Read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. It explains it better than I ever could.
I also want to go back to, well, first of all, in the chat, Greg put up there BIPOC, for people who don't know. That's the acronym for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So it groups all of those marginalized groups into a way to talk about them collectively. And so when you're talking about like the forces of oppression, it kind of can apply to multiple groups, and that's
that's intersectionality, in a nutshell. I mean, and again,
right.
when oftentimes when people say people of color, it tends to wash out a lot of people's images. So when we're really talking about anti-blackness or anti-indigenous sentiments, when you want to talk about it specifically. Don't say people of color, because the experience of an Asian American in America is going to be vastly different experience of a Black American in America. It doesn't mean that Asian Americans don't face discrimination. It's just not the same level and not the same history. And oftentimes, other minorities are complicit in that anti-Blackness as well. If you've seen Jordan Peele's Get Out, there's a scene in a garden party where all these white liberals are talking and laughing, and in that group is one Japanese man, which kind of struck home for me, because the idea is that there is, you don't need to be white to uphold white supremacy. It's basically what I'm saying. All right, next question.
Well, let's see. This is hard. I'm not sure who wants to answer this.
Kathy, I can't hear.
Is it possible to understand the ideas of slavery, racism, and lynching from a biblical and theological perspective? That's huge. There's a lot of books about that. There's a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree,
which is a phenomenal book. Phenomenal book.
So I just saw a post this week that there was a poll that said Christian Americans are more likely to be prejudiced than the general American population.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Yeah, so
Well, I mean, Jesus was lynched. Jesus was, like, like accused of being a criminal by the powers that be and the state at the time. He was publicly humiliated and executed as a way of telling people, don't do this. Jesus was lynched. I mean, and that's kind of what James Cone was talking about on the cross and lynch tree, is that, Christians in America need to understand that they can't understand the cross without understanding this. You have to put the lynching tree and the cross on the same page, looking at them, to understand how we approach Christ in America.
And I think we'll talk about this a little more in the next session too, when we talk about the Lutheran Church and racism, right. I assume. So I also wanted to say that you talked briefly about segregation and how things happened. In the South, the Jim Crow was sort of a forced segregation, but then there was also, like you mentioned, the GI Bill, which had redlining practices, which was specific areas that Black people were not allowed to buy homes. And there were specific rules in the GI Bill, which was federal funding for home ownership, that did not allow Black people to participate in. So that actually was a foundation of how we got to the geographic segregation of homes, and then schools, and then people that were denied the ability to own a home. And then, like you said, that gets carried on down through the generations, because then that equity and housing stability doesn't happen for those people.
And in the times when communities were, this brings it closer to the work I do in Salisbury, when communities were able to build collective wealth. Obviously the big one everyone knows about is Black Wall Street, Tulsa. Essentially, one of the wealthiest Black communities in America was wiped out, completely wiped out. Like dozens of people were murdered. Everyone was evicted. In Salisbury, there was, when Matthew Williams was lynched and his body was dragged through the Black neighborhoods, that was a Black neighborhood. It is called Georgetown, unofficially. There's a book by historian Linda Dwyer, Around the Pond, Georgetown. The neighborhood was, there was actually some integration going on in the neighborhood, but it was primarily a Black neighborhood. When they built Route 13, which goes north and south roughly, thank you, that's Around the Pond by Linda Dwyer, and then Route 50, which goes west and east roughly. When they built those, in the decade or two after Matthew Williams was lynched, it wiped that town off the map, or wiped that neighborhood off the map. They took most of the houses through eminent domain, and basically Georgetown no longer exists. Right now there is a very phenomenal mural showing 5 of Black historical figures in town, the Purnells, the Handys, and also Sergeant William Butler. It's a big mural on Church Street near the Chipman Cultural Center, roughly where Georgetown was. So we're kind of starting to make the connection that there's a past that's been, I don't even want to say forgotten. The past has been purposefully buried, because, so even when there is collective wealth, when there's community wealth, when there's people building up their own communities, there is a tone of white supremacy that will try to knock that down again. So that's, violence is another resort to keeping segregation and keeping inequality exist. Because again, that's how it all was created. It was created to make a hierarchical structure with wealthy white landowners and gentry on the top, business owners and corporate people and political people on the top nowadays. You have your business and your middle class and so on and so on. Then you have your poor and working class white folks, but they always have Black people underneath them. And that's kind of how a lot of people Jonathan Menzel wrote a book recently called Dying of Whiteness. Basically, why people will vote against their best interest in many cases just because they don't want to have they're too invested in the white supremacy structure to get rid of it, and they'd rather die, in some cases literally die, rather than seemingly give up that privilege.
I think a lot of some of this also goes all the way back to Reconstruction, because there was supposed to be a concerted effort during Reconstruction to, you know, allow Black families that were working on land to get like the 40 acres and a mule, but they never got their 40 acres and their mule. And I think, and a lot of the Reconstruction items that were supposed to happen didn't happen.
Well, but a lot did happen, though. I mean, like the number of Black politicians getting into office then was phenomenal. It's like, more than we have now, that's for sure. Like, and again, that seeming success was what was pushed back against, and that's what led to the violence of the Reconstruction period, and especially the terror that evolved with the first, second, and third iterations of the KKK during Jim Crow. That's like, that violent backlash happened because of the successes during Reconstruction. Just kind of like where we are now can be seen as a violent backlash to the election of the first Black president in America. Like, I mean, you can't not see Trump and not see him as being an anti-Obama in a lot of ways. Is there another question?
Let's see. I don't know. Is there a known biblical basis for the idea of white supremacy?
That's probably a better question for Pastor Greg in one of the other sessions. But
maybe
no.
week.
No. I mean, like people use the Bible to justify everything. I mean, like you can probably find something in the Bible to justify, to make a justification for anything. But like, this is a personal witness here. I find scripture complicated. I find religion complicated. I find faith complicated. So I try to make it as simple as possible for my own soul, which makes it more complicated in the long run, eventually, ironically. But Jesus said the greatest commandments are love your neighbor and love God, and that's it. Everything else is just details. So nothing can justify white supremacy. I mean, like, nothing can justify exploitation of any kind. It's against God. So that's my personal witness.
There's plenty of examples in the Old Testament of slavery, and and the ideas about why.
Right, but like again.
Not to justify it, but the opposite.
No. People were like oh, the Pauline idea of like slaves obey your masters and all that bunk. I mean, like, the fact is, like, people can find a justification if they want to. It doesn't mean maybe there's a biblical justification. It does not mean there is a gospel justification for it, I guess I would say. I'm not a biblical literalist, if you guys have figured that out yet.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. We have time to do breakout groups if folks want to.
I would love to
Justina,
do one.
Can you do that for us? I think we give people maybe 3 minutes to see if they want to sign off or if they want to stay on and go into a small group to talk about some of what we've had going on here today.
Right. So we have about 4 to 5, 3 to 4 participants per room. And
I think 4 would be good.
Okay, so I'm gonna do a countdown, and for those who would like to sign off, I see the numbers are dropping, so people are actually signing off right now. Kathy.
Yes, I see that.
So, right.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, we can have the recording and the slides available. As
Right. All right. Well, we've got 22 folks left on that may want to do a breakout. So why don't we go ahead and do that, and we'll just see
Yeah.
if we have anyone left. Thank you.
Why are you doing that? Oh, yeah.
Hi,
Doing the
Brian.
breakout groups and for being here. And next week, Pastor Greg Knapp is going to talk about the racism in the Lutheran Church specifically, and he can also answer some more of these theological questions, I suspect. So I hope to see you then. And as usual, if you have any follow-up, please email me. And thanks again to James. It was great. It was so much good information. I really appreciate all the work you did to pull that together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Kathy.
Bye, Renee. Bye, Beth
Good
and
night,
Beth.
everybody.
Bishop.
Good night.
Can
Kathy.
someone tell me how you get the link to this? I
Yeah,
got
so
it. Someone sent it to me on Facebook, so I don't really know if that was the real way to get it.
you can email, you can get it to the